share my screen here in a second, and I will pop up a prayer. Here we go. Using this all this week with a few sessions. So again, as much of a reflection as it is a prayer, but back in February, I was able to go with a few brothers over to Bruges to celebrate the 175th anniversary of the first ever Xaverian Brothers sponsored school, the St. Francis Xavier Institute. And while I was there, they gave me a tour of just some of the sites that are important to the history of the brothers and the foundation of the order. And one that struck me was this St. Walburgis Church. And while that's not a church that Theodore Ryken himself celebrated Mass at, his spiritual advisor, a Jesuit priest, celebrated Mass, was the head pastor at this church. And so it struck me that, Ryken likely quite often walked on these very cobblestones and stopped and paused up at the statue of St. Francis Xavier. Not a reach at all to think that that's a big influence on him naming the order after Francis Xavier and thus reaching the Xaverian Brothers. So that's kind of the context for the prayer and reflection that I have in front of you that I will lead us in now. So in Ryken's time, a year after he had started the first foundation in Bruges, he would visit his spiritual advisor, who was in residence at St. Walburgis. No doubt on such occasions and others, Ryken gazed up at the statue of St. Francis Xavier. The image of Francis Xavier was a reminder to stand ready, to respond to a call, to move beyond the familiar, to move out of our own comfort zone. The image of St. Francis Xavier continued to inspire Ryken and his followers, even though they were ill-prepared and overextended. Ryken, like Xavier before him, knew that there would always be good and reasonable objections to moving forward, that there would always be a need for more planning and preparation. But Ryken, like Xavier, was insatiable, even relentless in his mission impulse, seeing people and places in desperate need of hearing the good news of God's love for them. He could not wait for a better moment. No one of us is fully prepared to address all the needs in our school communities, particularly now with this COVID-19 reality. We all likely know full well this feeling of being overextended and ill-prepared. So in this time of spirit, we pray to you, Lord, and ask that you grant us the strength and vision to stand ready and respond to the great challenges we face today. Like Ryken, help us remain steadfast in the face of obstacles to live out our mission as Catholic school educators and staff. True to the image of St. Francis Xavier, help us, Lord, to step forth to serve the people in our XBSS community. For this we pray. Amen. Amen. Well, thank you all again for joining us here, and in that spirit of Ryken's perseverance, we're going to continue to persevere through a lot of our continuing challenges. So on the survey that I had put out, here were a few of the items that you guys had asked to talk about, so we'll let that guide our conversation today. The third one I added in, I just had a phone call from a school head, and I'm going to say it now. Hopefully I'll remember at the end. If any of you can share with me via email a blank copy of your teacher contracts. I don't know if you need your head of school permission to do that. If so, if you can ask them, but looking for any numbers, not looking for salary scales. I'm not looking for names. I'm just looking for the language in your teacher contracts. If you don't mind emailing me a copy, I'll pass that on. And if you want to see what others submit, I'm happy to share them all back in that regard. But so these will be the conversations that I start with. So let me just, again, kind of open it up to anybody at this point. So the first one, folks just wanted to know, is there any new guidance on PPP loans and the accounting? Are any of you kind of changing your approach to your accounting procedures based on any new information you've received? So I'll let anybody chime into that
one. So I had a call with our auditors last week just to keep up with them on how they plan on looking at it. They didn't really change where they stood before, with us wanting to record it as a loan, with forgiveness being realized hopefully in the next fiscal year. Sorry, my dog is barking at the construction workers outside. They, obviously they're going to they're offering a review at a cost, I'm sure, prior to us submitting forgiveness to Peoples. And they have kind of a really neat toolkit worksheet that I've been using with each payroll as each has passed since we got funded, to keep track of our payroll and all benefit related costs and utilities. It's just kind of a nice all-in-one. I'm happy to share it. It's what I used to apply originally, so I'm hoping for people's it's just consistent and is transparent as to when we apply for forgiveness.
Pretty much same here on the Zavarian end in Brooklyn. The one thing I picked up yesterday on a webinar, and I shared with Patrick the slides and information from that webinar, and I think he said he may circulate it after this meeting, which would be fine. Feel free to take a look. One little minor thing they said was just don't change your cost of business. Don't try to expedite a payroll, or don't try to expedite funding of extra utilities or anything that may be considered forgivable. That could warrant some issues. They just said to allow the money to be used in the 8-week period for what's forgivable and what's in that 8-week range, and not try to reinvent the business wheel to incorporate more than perhaps we should.
I know
My
that
understanding too.
Go ahead, Lynn, and then we'll come back to Rhonda.
Okay, thank you. Just quickly, I know that just recently what we did was we segregated the money completely and opened up a separate account. Maybe some of you have already done that, but we did move all of the money into its own account, for the accounting purposes.
Yeah, I was at 7 board meetings last week, and Ben and Brother Richard were as well, and that seemed to be the approach more the schools were taking, that separate account. Walter, I know you guys did that at Zavarian as well. Rhonda?
My understanding is that the loan forgiveness also extends to future costs, and the webinars and things that I've been attending have been strongly recommending that you document now the reasons for requesting the loan, and also what those future costs would be, such as the utilities after the 8-week period, the additional employees that you're bringing on, other types of hardships that you might be experiencing. So.
I concur with that. I think need was the big word our accountants are talking about. Forgiveness stipulations could change, so just continue to document need in general, with the idea that if something does change in the future that becomes forgivable, you're going to already have it documented and not have to go back to it. Obviously, the forgivable stipulations that are out there now are pretty solid, but they could be expanded upon, and you just keep stressing the word need and necessity. Keep documenting that. Keep documenting need and necessity.
I think for Malden Catholic, we just had a number of board members that are concerned that, or assume that everything will become public at some point, and that the letter that you write with the forgiveness will be very important in terms of documenting, or in terms of at least giving the story about why it should be forgiven. So I mean, we're starting to put effort into thinking about how that letter is crafted, and just making the mental preparation that the amount and potentially probably the letter be made public at some point.
Well, if I could jump in on that end, because that was one of the questions I did want to bring up, because I have seen just from the board meetings last week, some of our schools are taking different approaches. And Stephanie, I don't know if you might be willing to comment here. So if you haven't seen it, in the last couple of weeks, the New York Times and the Washington Post have put out articles that are, in the wheelhouse of critical of private schools and Catholic schools accepting these monies. So I know in Stephanie's case, in Good Counsel's case, the Washington Post did call the school and kind of put them on the spot. And I think a lot of folks feel Good Counsel did a very good job justifying its acceptance of it. And where I'm going on this is Good Counsel's approach was, you guys have been very public in terms of putting out to your community, here's how much we received, here's why we received it. Other schools I think are hesitant to do that on the onset to this. So I don't know, Stephanie, if you can kind of enlighten that a little bit, just your guys' thought process of communication and disclosure on all those dollars.
Yeah, sure. So it's in line with, I think, the way we've been operating. Since we went to distance learning, we've just communicated as much as possible and trying to be as transparent as possible with our parents. So the day before that article was published, we had sent an email out to the community letting them know that we had received, a PPP loan, and we let them know the amount. And we had our memo, our PPP justification memo had been completed internally for the board. And Paul, our president, used that memo as the basis for the talking points with the Washington Post reporter. So, we laid out why we felt the loan was necessary. We talked about, our endowment being modest in comparison with other schools. And so I think that's why we came out of that we came out of that pretty much unscathed from that article. So, and, the response from the parent body has been overwhelmingly positive. We got comments like, good for you, glad you're able to get that loan, so on and so forth. So right now we feel good about, I guess, the coverage we've received.
Yeah, very good. I think even, media aside, I mean, for those of you in your roles to have at least some of those data points ready to help the heads of the schools if and when they have to defend, well, whether it's defend or whether just, sharing via transparency why you've accepted that. Good counsel, clearly sharing those endowment figures, I think, was important, because the Washington Post article was going after these schools with 50, 60, $70 million endowments. And I think, again, good counsel made a great argument that they're not in that wheelhouse. And that certainly helped. But other thoughts or questions on PPP in any form, either has to do with media and or accounting procedures? Okay. The last session we just had, advancement folks had asked if anybody was considering giving it back, and I think that question was coming out of that media. I have not heard from any of the 13 schools that they're entertaining that, but just know that that question is being tossed around some circles. Larry Fury from Zavarian Brothers in Westwood said he's aware of a private Catholic school in Long Island that is giving back $4 million. I think they were having a hard time justifying it. Walter used that word necessity. There was some recent guidance that came out, a couple weeks old now, that was really asking even private schools to say that you fully explored all other sources of liquidity before you access these loan dollars. So that's just, again, I'm sure a piece of the media may want to jump all over you if they haven't already. Let me switch gears a little bit to, there were a number of questions submitted just about budget. So I'm going to kind of take them in chunks, but if anybody can kind of talk about how you guys are internally budgeting through the end of this current fiscal year, modifications that you're seeing, the impact on cash flow, and then we'll kind of talk about next year's budgeting processes. And again, I've seen a lot of those conversations from the board meetings, but how about this year? What are you guys seeing in terms of adjustments to cash flow and adjustments to year end based on trends?
I mean, I'm happy to chime in. I think when I looked at projections, that's part of why we documented with PPP, we'd be about $1 million loss. We're refunding buses that haven't happened for the month, 2.5 months, as well as our middle school tuition includes lunch. So we do feel obligated to return a piece of that as well. And all of the trips that we had planned for, we're refunding. We're trying to make families as whole as possible. But the loss of our auxiliary revenue, we do a lot in June when campus closes, and so we can't have that programming, as well as our bookstores, pretty significant revenue. especially towards May commencement. So I've tried to include all of that. Plus, obviously, we're going to exhaust our tuition assistance budget, which we don't always do. But we plan on seeing that one because delinquencies are probably 60,000 more at this point compared to last year. So, that was all part of our documentation when we applied for the PPP and continued with executive committee last week that, the outlook isn't looking any better for this year. And then obviously summer is a huge revenue source for us that we won't be seeing for next year's budget either.
In addition to that, I know we've also looked at the loss from our gala, which we typically have in the spring, and we're no longer going to be able to have that. Our alumni events and reunions, that was another thing that we looked at. Annual fund income. At this point, we're projecting that the annual fund income will probably be about 30% short of what we were anticipating and budgeting for this year. That was one of the areas that we looked at. And like you said, additional financial aid expense and helping these families just get through this year.
One quick thing we did is, not knowing where standard school day is going to go, we're factoring into our 21 budget the potential for staggering busing, where we may have to have 2 sets of drop-offs and pickups. The day is split or something like that. It's clearly an unknown, but we're trying to quantify a number, which we are putting into our budget.
Along all those,
Go ahead.
this is Chris Sapienza from Mount St. Joe. Along those lines too, we've budgeted, again, without knowing. We're going through the re-enrollment process now, but we added a little bump onto our normal summer attrition, and then also the board has asked us. We did pass our budget last week at the board meeting, but they've asked us to look at couple different scenarios. One is if we're out for the first semester, and also if we have 25 fewer students than we originally budgeted. So we're working through those models now. The tough part with not starting for the second, if we're out until the end of the first semester or a portion of the year, is that if we're still doing distance learning, we're still paying everybody. So we're not going to see a whole lot of, we'll have some cuts in utilities and things like that, but we're gonna lose a lot more revenue from the auxiliary stuff if we're not in school for the semester.
And we're also taking into account our international students. Some of them went home when all of this happened with the intention that they should be returning. However, it depends what travel looks like in the fall. Even if school can normally open, can these kids come back and join us? And their tuition is a little bit more than our regular tuition, so that could have a pretty big impact for us.
At Malden Catholic, we're actually assuming that we won't be able to run the bus service just due to social distancing guidelines next year. Obviously it's very preliminary, but that's kind of what we're assuming. And obviously that comes with some attrition impact as well. But that, when we were going over our kind of very preliminary plan, that really struck that could be an enrollment impact from that, and that it really kind of makes sense with the social distancing guidelines.
Yeah, sure. And that was part of our staggering too. I think it was actually even another bus, because you might not be able, you're not going to be able to sit 2 in a seat or something like that. It could be a whole nother bus just to accommodate the proper distance.
Yep.
That's what we're thinking too. We have 9 bus routes, but one of them for one of them already, we have to use 2 buses because we bring in so many kids from Prince George's County. And so we're going to have to double, maybe triple that capacity in order to make sure we can bring those kids to school. if their parents had to drive, it would be best case scenario, an hour-long commute. And so, we know we're going to incur some additional expense just getting those kids to school. And in the budget that we passed last week, we assumed a 5% drop in enrollment, which means we had to make some decisions about compensation and staffing to basically recoup the lost revenue from making that assumption, which we're going to explain. We've already kind of communicated that out to our faculty and staff, but we're going to communicate it verbally via Zoom on Friday.
I think you had this as a note for agreements or what, but we communicated during a town hall 2 weeks ago, hiring freeze and salary freeze and such. But with all those different areas potentially impacting further, I was curious if there was language or when it's shared. If I have a call with our legal counsel, because what do we add to this year's agreements in case we do have to riff or something? And I don't know if people have already incorporated or communicated that to faculty and staff.
In our contracts and agreements, there is a clause that has like a get out of jail free card. So if enrollment doesn't support or enrollment levels aren't fully at capacity or whatever before August 1st, we can make that contract null and void.
As this conversation's broadened up, I just kind of invite, other discussions were, budget next year, how are you handling development, enrollment, and then also kind of the non-tuition revenue drivers, which we started touching upon, the buses, but what about camps, rentals, dining, bookstore? So what are some of the approaches you're taking in terms of all those? I would say, I forgot who said the 5%, I think Stephanie, you did. That seemed to be what I hear more often. A lot of schools are budgeting a 5% enrollment loss, even if right now they're in good shape and numbers look good. It's just they're still anticipating some summer melt. So that piece I've heard. We had the development folks. Some folks were saying they were keeping the budgets as is. Others were reducing that. But you guys are on the front lines to that. So if anybody can kind of speak to how you're those figures across the board.
Well, we modeled what it would look like if enrollment dropped 2%, 5%, 10%, or 20%, just to, understand the financial impact. 5% was where we could, maintain employment with everybody that we have now. If we end up in the 10% territory, we're going to have to entertain, rifts. And our board and finance committee obviously are well aware of that. But we've, so far we haven't experienced the summer melt that we typically do. And I think part of that is because we delivered on our distance learning program, right away. Whereas the public schools, where 42% of our incoming class comes from, public schools, it took them a couple of weeks to get up and running. So I think we're benefiting from the fact that we've shown that we can competently deliver, in the online format. But I'm still worried, about what's going to happen in June and July and August. Very thankful to have the PPP loan money.
I don't know if this is, we have about 70 families who have had delinquencies or are already trying to reduce next year's tuition. So it's been organizing that has been a bit of a struggle. But it was something I thought that was kind of interesting. We went through, and almost 80% of the families, or almost 90% of the families already were below the average tuition. So I mean, really where we're seeing the struggle is amongst our lower middle income families. That's really where we're seeing the struggle right now. We haven't seen it as much at the higher end, really almost very little at all. But amongst the the lower middle income families, we're seeing significant pressure.
We created an actual COVID-19 relief request for relief application. We're kind of incorporating that into our current AR collections, just to get it on file. And not sure where we're going with it yet, but will we provide some relief now? Will we provide some relief next year? But at least we're just trying to get out in front with it and see kind of what they would be requesting, what their circumstances are, employment circumstances are. More of a questionnaire for us. We've only gotten a few back, but again, I think that's going to probably increase as we get into the summer.
We did the same thing, and we've had 81 applications so far. Most of those families were just about finished paying for current year tuition, so what they're really asking for is aid for next year.
I know what we've seen is last year for the entire year, we had about 23 appeals to the financial aid application decisions. And this year, since this began, we have seen over 50 in just the 2 months. So I know we're anticipating, that that's going to continue, especially throughout the summer as things change.
As we're seeing applications as well for this, what we're trying to do is respond, and any possible assistance or additional assistance, we're focusing it in the summer months to make the biggest impact for when they're struggling, but also to try and give them the most help when they need it.
I know someone mentioned annual fund being down, and we were noticing the same. So our advancement team reached out to like a small group of core donors to create a COVID-19 basically appeals fund that then we'll designate out to folks over the next few months. But we did see about $1 million raised just for that. So I know that they had success with trying to help add to knowing that our operational budget couldn't really absorb all of that. They basically told donors we might need this for like over a 2-year period because we just don't know the length of the impact for these families as they recover and how long it takes. But I'm happy to connect if I know some of the other advancement groups are doing the same.
Cindy, did I have any capacity left for other schools?
Right. It's always strange because I love our advancement group, but they always struggle hitting that annual fund number, but then they find these few donors and I'm like, they come through in a crisis. That's always the way, right? They don't think we need it when things look good. They appreciated the stories that I shared with them on the appeals form of what people were going through. I just think it's pretty significant though that these families are emailing me saying they're still in the same place that they were a month ago when they initially reached out, which leaves me with a heavy heart of how much we can really help them over the next few years.
Back on the financial aid side, we had the admissions folks on earlier this week, and they were talking about the increase in requests for financial aid, but a few folks were talking about kind of the what if scenarios that some of the schools are seeing requests for aid even though a family's situation hasn't currently been impacted, but they're just saying, I'm concerned I might lose my job, so I want school X to give me, an extra $3,000 financial aid right now. And, the conversation being, come back to us if that happens. But again, I don't know if that's stuff that's reached your plate, but it sounded like a few of them were trying to navigate those nuances of families asking for help, even though they still are both employed and, current family income hasn't been impacted much. But another challenge to that. I did 10 years of financial aid, so I know how you get some of those families trying to preemptive get help when they might not need it. Don't know if others are seeing that.
I know we have had that type of request from a number of people. And, you know, we have asked them to wait. What we've done is our first payment is due for next year in June. So for those that are concerned, we've extended and allowed them to have that payment either be in July or August, and it's extended out at the end of the school year. Or, you know, we've also, you know, allow them to wait until September and not have to make a payment. Or if they do make a payment, no, we've changed our refund policy so that they can get a full refund through September, just to give them some, you know, some confidence in the fact that they're not going to lose out if they do make that June payment. So we're trying to work individually with each one of the families that, you know, that reach out to us.
Mm-hmm. Other questions you have for each other? I'm trying to do my teacher due diligence of giving enough wait time, so hopefully I don't want to cut anybody off if they had some other items. I've been largely in communication with the principals about the ESSER funds, which is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Funds, which is a subset of CARES. I think I may have in the past CC'd some of you on those communications, but just know that's another bucket of funding. It operates a little bit like Title I in the sense of how much money rolls into the local education agency, the LEA. But I've been communicating almost weekly with the principals that every school in our network is entitled to a proportional share. So if your school represents, say, I'm going to use Malden Catholic, for example. So if Malden Catholic, Sean, how many kids are at MC? If you're there.
That the ESSER calculation is going to be 565.
So 565 kids. So the way that ESSER works is it's just a straight percentage. So if Malden Catholic's population of 565, it's what is the population of all students in Malden, both public, private, and any other independent. And so if the LEA in Malden gets $1 million and MC's population represents 10% of the total population, they get $100,000. It's just a matter of the schools advocating for those funds. But if you all in your roles want additional information on that, I can forward you a lot of what I've been sending to the principals in that regard. But you know, the USCCB, United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, is saying this could be a decent chunk of change for schools. However, a lot of the public schools are giving misinformation to the Catholic schools, trying to tell them you don't qualify or this is how we're going to do it. And it's really just a matter of advocating for your rights on that. But there could be some decent dollars. And there are parameters to how the monies are used. But if that's any information you'd like to see, I'm happy to forward some of that as well to you. Just shoot me an email.
Patrick, just kind of. Yep. Just kind of further, I mean, Patrick's been right on top of this and really helped us a lot. I mean, for Malden Catholic, it's probably around 115,000 or so. So it ends up being a pretty significant amount for us. And it looks like we can use it. You know, we're talking about next year having, you know, the big thermometers when you walk in, try to be able to, you know, test people's temperatures. We think we can use it for that. We think we can use it in terms of, you know, just the funds to be able to all the cleaning supplies used in the building on a daily basis, and even, you know, just, you know, getting the stockpile back to a full amount. We think we can use it on that, and just you know, basically we think we can use it for our technology costs for, you know, the distance learning, and I'd like to be able to use it, and we're going to try to use it for potentially, you know, some summer programs for our existing students. I mean, it is pretty interesting, and you know, we just got the allocations yesterday from Massachusetts, but it seems to be pretty, you know, we have a pretty good relationship, Malden at least for this one. So it seems to be pretty substantial.
Yep. So again, I'll offer if you want info on it, if your principal hasn't brought it up with you, I'm happy to share any of those details. And again, based on where you're at, I can also tell you who you're likely going to have to deal with in that regard. Yep. So I got a few folks. You know what? I might just send it out to everybody. I got a few folks chatting about that, so I'll forward that to you. But I think I'm pretty well up to speed on how it works, and so if you have questions, let me know. Like Sean said, and offered a few thoughts there. Yeah, Cynthia.
I have one question. Just it sounds like it's really your relationship with the city or town. Is that fair to say? Because we get
Correct.
a bill every year for the pilot program that we refuse to participate in. So I'm guessing that might
If you
create some.
So that's one of the stipulations. So even if you have never previously participated in title funds, you are still eligible. And that is one of the things, though, what we're hearing across the country is some public schools are trying to tell the private schools, nope, you can't have any of the money because you've said no in the past. And we can point specifically to the line items in the bill that say that's doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. So even if you turn down all title funding in the past, you can still access this money. If you're a part of, like, again, the bigger Boston, Brooklyn, chances are your local Catholic school office pools those monies. So you might have to deal directly with your Catholic school office, but I can give you guidance on that depending on where you reside. But definitely, I'm telling you right now, there is money for all 13 schools. It's a matter of whether you want to go and get it, plain and simple. I mean, but there is money for all 13 schools. Yeah, I'll pass that along to everybody. Again, I'd encourage you to, well, any other questions people want to throw out before I wrap it up? Okay. Well, again, please use the reply all on some of the prior email chains that you got if you have questions along the way. I know our admissions folks have been going back and forth since our meeting on Monday, posing a few other ideas that have come to pass. And I might just touch base again towards the end of the school year as it's coming up, just to see if anybody's got lingering questions as we go into the summer. Happy to do this again, but again, always want to be respectful of your time. So I'll check in again early June, see how folks are doing. But again, going back to our reflection at the start, Riken faced a million obstacles and still created this order, and had he ever given up, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now, and most of these schools wouldn't exist. So kind of in the spirit of his perseverance, overcoming obstacles, I thank you for all you guys are doing to overcome these challenges, and bless you for your work. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks all.
Safe, everybody.